Chapter 2. Can this be real? It's a question we've been asking more and more often in recent years. Before Trump, and much like reality, fake news was once easier to define. It meant pseudo-news, from Daily Show satire to trivial gossip, and presenting falsehoods as if they are true. Now the phrase can be an accusation designed to discredit any news you don't like. In Syria, for instance, President Bashar al-Assad used it to discount allegations of torture in one of his military prisons. "We are living in a fake news era," he said, as if that explained everything. Actually, the political use of false stories goes back centuries. In a January 2018 message, Pope Francis, who defines fake news as the spreading of disinformation online or in the traditional media, suggested that the first fake story dates back to the book of Genesis. It happened when a crafty serpent lied to a woman. Equating sin's early history with fakery is clever, but not that enlightening. One of the first people to practice fake news in the U.S. was Benjamin Franklin, who printed a phony newspaper to mislead the British and create sympathy for the new country during negotiations. Throughout the 19th century, publishing rumors and blatant lies about political enemies was a common political tactic, culminating in the Hearst-led propaganda campaign before and during the Spanish-American War. Even Honest Abe Lincoln worked with newspapers that sought to shape opinion through speculation and partisan attacks. Donald Trump certainly lies in public more than past presidents, and sometimes for the most trivial or ego-driven reasons, but presidential prevaricating is a common tactic dating back to the nation's early days, often in the service of false narratives. After escalating provocations with Mexico until he obtained the necessary pretext in 1846, President James Polk finally announced war exists, thus explaining away how it had happened. After defeating Spain, William McKinley said that he wanted to, quote, uplift and civilize and Christianize, end quote, the Filipinos, and, quote, by God's grace do the very best we could by them. But they had already declared their independence, so doing the best actually meant allowing the worst, killing and burning villages during a 12-year war of resistance. Harry Truman said he wanted to assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. But the pledge didn't stop him from approving CIA manipulation of elections in Greece and Italy. And when asked about the U.S. operation to overthrow Guatemalan government of Jacobo Arbenz in 1953, the State Department called the charges ridiculous and untrue. This saved President Eisenhower the burden of lying about it himself. In his memoirs, however, Ike did step up, still denying that the U.S. had anything to do with the coup. President Johnson's most famous lie was his 1964 announcement that 2 U.S. destroyers had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. But the following year, he railed about atrocities in the Dominican Republic. The reports were also untrue, but gave him an excuse to occupy the country. Nixon, of course, misled the public more than most, from bombing Cambodia to covering up dirty tricks. But Reagan also did his part. The Organization of Caribbean States had pleaded in the 1983 U.S. intervention in Grenada, he once claimed. Actually, the pleading came from the other side. He also repeatedly denounced the Russians for spraying toxic chemicals over Afghanistan. The truth there, pollen-laden feces had been dropped by honeybees over Laos and Cambodia. Afghanistan wasn't affected. And Bill Clinton certainly lied about having sex with that woman, but more crucial deceptions escaped much notice. Bombing a Sudanese drug factory in 1998, for example, he called it a front for nerve gas production, an assertion that proved false. More crucially, he didn't mention that the U.S. had been conducting a covert campaign to destabilize Sudan's government for 2 years, passing on military equipment to the Sudan People's Liberation Army. That was a touchy subject, since the guerrillas were using women and children as forced labor. mortaring urban areas, killing relief workers, and shooting down civilian airliners. In the early 1920s, warnings had already been issued about the power of radio propaganda, and in 1927 the League of Nations passed a resolution opposing obviously inaccurate, highly exaggerated, and deliberately distorted news. In the 1930s, an international federation of journalists set up a tribunal to handle information that promoted hatred and violence. Too little, too late, some might say. But democracy survived, and the advance of fascism was halted, at least temporarily. The difference in the 21st century is that even more advanced techniques are used to peddle false or misleading ideas and narratives, and unfortunately, when people repeatedly exposed to lies or confronted with the truth, too many double down and believe the lie even more. Two reasons are that, number one, repetition works, even when the lie is part of a story that debunks it. And number two, people tend to believe what they want to believe, a concept known as confirmation bias, or wishful thinking, the influence of desire on beliefs. When people want a certain idea to be true, they usually end up believing that. Unfortunately, this can lead some people to stop looking, and it suggests that we don't see things objectively. Instead, we pick out what makes us feel good or confirms what we already believe. Even so, why are so many people taken in by lies and fake news? Among the reasons posited by experts are disenfranchisement, alienation, ignorance, denial, fear, and uncertainty. In a recent study of Facebook that analyzed posts between 2010 and 2014, researchers found that people mainly share information that confirms their prejudices, paying little attention to facts and veracity. The result, said the report, is the, quote, proliferation of biased narratives fomented by unsubstantiated rumors, mistrust, and paranoia. The authors specifically studied trolling, the creation of provocation, often false information, with the hope of spreading it widely and sparking an overreaction. Their report concluded that, quote, many mechanisms cause false information to gain acceptance, which in turn generate false beliefs that, once adopted by an individual, are highly resistant to correction, end quote. In its most toxic form, trolling can become a form of bullying or virtual harassment. CNN host Fareed Zakaria experienced this firsthand after a strange site published a post with the headline, CNN host Fareed Zakaria calls for jihad rape of white women. The false and awful charge was that in a blog post he had endorsed the exploitation of American women as, quote, sex slaves as a way to decimate the white race, plus an allegation that he had tweeted, quote, every death of a white person brings tears of joy to my eyes, end quote. It sounded absurd, but people began sharing links, tweeting and retweeting, and adding their own disgusting comments. As far-right websites spread the story, hysteria mounted, and there were calls for Zakaria to be fired, deported, or murdered. For a few days, the digital intimidation veered out into the real world, he wrote in a column. Some people called my house late one night and woke up and threatened my daughters, who are 7 and 12. The urbane TV host concluded that those spreading the slime had no interest in facts. They were interested in feeding prejudices, he wrote. So, when the occasional debunker would point out that there was no evidence of the post anywhere, it made little difference. When confronted with evidence that the story was utterly false, it only convinced many that there was a conspiracy and a cover-up, he wrote. Nevertheless, fake news is undeniably amusing at times, especially when it appeals to our assumptions, suspicions, or fantasies. It has something that makes us want to share. One of the most clever and benign examples in recent times, which also illustrates just how far trolling can go, revolves around a cheeky question raised shortly after the 2008 presidential election. Did Sarah Palin know that Africa is a continent? Surprisingly, Fox News broke the story, quoting an unnamed McCain campaign source. But who could that be? Inquiring minds and Palin haters wanted to know. So when a name finally popped up in a blog, it was soon being discussed on MSNBC by David Schuster. After all, the source of the leak was apparently a McCain policy advisor named Martin Eisenstadt. The problem was that Martin Eisenstadt didn't exist. He had a blog, of course, but it was a transparent satire, and he was called a senior fellow at a think tank, the Harding Institute for Freedom and Democracy, but the institute, apparently named for one of America's least revered presidents, turned out to be nothing but a fake website. Various TV clips and documentaries about Eisenstadt were also fake, but claiming to be the source for the Africa charge against Palin was just the latest ruse. An elaborate hoax had been underway for months. Eisenstadt was created by two filmmakers, Eaton Gorlin and Dan Mirisch. As the New York Times eventually reported, they succeeded in fooling countless media outlets, including the New Republic and the Los Angeles Times, into believing that Eisenstadt was a real political insider. Over a year and a half, he repeatedly infiltrated political coverage as media outlets picked up on his fake political commentaries and video clips. The character was played by Gorland, and the hoax was supposed to help pitch a TV show based on Eisenstadt. There were some great moments, as well as several episodes of a fake BBC democracy, The Last Republican. They even filmed rebuttals in which Eisenstadt threatened to sue the BBC for taking him out of context. Performance art was merging with world-class trolling and crashing the electoral party. Political satire was turning into fake news. In June 2008, the duo produced what appeared to be an interview with Eisenstadt on Iraqi television promoting construction of a casino in the Green Zone in Baghdad. When outraged Iraqi bloggers protested the casino ideas, they sent out a news release in which he apologized. In October, just a month before the election, Eisenstadt blogged that Samuel J. Wurzelbacher, a.k.a. Joe the Plumber, was closely related to Charles Keating, the disgraced former savings and loan chief. It wasn't true, but other bloggers ran with it. After Election Day, Fox News cited anonymous McCain aides as having claimed that Palin didn't know Africa was a continent. Palin's people went after the anonymous sources for taking the governor's comment out of context. Mirisch and Gorlin weren't the source, but they jumped at the opportunity to make fun of what they called the media's propensity to rely on anonymous sources. On November 10th, they posted a long blog entry about the Fox report in which Eisenstadt claimed to be coming forward as the advisor who had leaked the Palin blunder. Schuster ran with it, and MSNBC later had to correct the mistake. Yet, groups like SourceWatch, a media watchdog project by the Center for Media and Democracy, had been warned about Eisenstadt and the Harding Institute for months. So, Martin Eisenstadt became a successful, though inconsequential, hoax, and apparently no one was hurt. In fact, the two won a book deal for a satirical novel, I Am Martin Eisenstadt, One Man's Wildly Inappropriate Adventures with the Last Republicans, a fake memoir. And in it, obviously, Eisenstadt denies any rumors that he doesn't exist. So, that's settled. The only mystery remaining is the extent of Palin's geographical knowledge.